They thought I was just a broken veteran pulling scrap to survive. But what my dog Smokey found buried under the frozen Montana dirt was a $40 million secret.
The German shepherd would not stop digging. 3 feet down into the frozen rail bed, her paws bloody, her amber eyes locked on something only she could see. Behind her stood a man the town called a junk picker, a homeless veteran scratching out a living on rusted railroad ties nobody wanted. They laughed at Jax Harlan when he passed. They spat when he was not looking. His country had used him up. His wife took what was left. Smokey was all he had. In 3 more minutes, Smokey was going to uncover something buried under that Montana ground for over 100 years. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The cold inside the cab of the 1994 GMC Sierra was a living thing at 4:40 in the morning, a slow grey cold that did not bite so much as it pressed, settling its weight against Jax Harlan's chest, his shoulders, the small of his back where the old shrapnel scar pulled tight in any temperature below freezing. He lay on his side across the bench seat, his canvas backpack folded under his head as a pillow, his army surplus sleeping bag pulled to his chin, and he listened the way a soldier always listens, even in sleep, even in dreams, even when his body had finally given up the fight and surrendered to a few brittle hours of unconsciousness. Smokey lay pressed against his stomach, her thick double coat, the only real heat in the truck. The German shepherd's slow, even breathing was a metronome he had measured his nights against for 9 years now, and he knew without opening his eyes that she was already awake, that her amber eyes were already tracking the ice fog rolling across the gravel lot of Hollis Briggs, scrap and salvage, that her ears had already registered the distant approach of the 453 eastbound freight on the active main line a half-mile to the south. The freight horn came at 5:14, exactly. The way it came every morning, 3 long pulls and 1 short, the way the regulations required at every grade crossing in the state of Montana. Jax did not move when it came. He had trained himself not to move. He had practiced, the way a man practices diffusing the same wire over and over until his fingers know the order without his mind. The first pull of the horn always lit the inside of his skull with something that was not quite memory and not quite hallucination, a flash of dust and copper, and the shape of a young Marine named Reyes, who had been walking ahead of him in a dry wadi outside Sangin in 2010, and who had been turned by an artillery shell IED into something Jax had carried home in pieces inside his own head. Smokey shifted. She always shifted on the first pull. She pressed her warm flank harder against his stomach, a deliberate, calibrated pressure, the kind of pressure she had been trained to apply in a working dog program at Lackland Air Force Base when she was 2 years old, and the kind of pressure she had been retrained to apply by Jax himself in the long quiet months at Walter Reed, when his nights had been worse than his days. She did not whine, she did not lick, she simply pressed and breathed and let the steadiness of her 91 pounds anchor him to the cracked vinyl of the bench seat, to the gravel lot in Coleridge Junction, Montana, to the year of his Lord 2025, to the truth that Reyes had been dead for 15 years, and that no amount of wakefulness was going to bring him back. By the 3rd pull of the freight horn, Jax was breathing again. By the short pull at the end, his hand was already on Smokey's shoulder, his thumb moving in the slow circle on the same patch of fur he had been rubbing for so many mornings that the guard hairs there were a shade lighter than the rest of her coat. "Morning, soldier," he said, very quietly, his voice rough with the cold and with disuse. He rarely spoke between sundown and sunup. The dog did not need words. Smokey thumped her tail once against the seat in answer. Outside the windshield, the world beyond the chain-link fence of Hollis's yard was the colour of dirty wool. Coleridge Junction sat in a wide, shallow bowl of the Yellowstone River Valley in eastern Montana, a town that had been built in 1897 on the back of a coal seam and a Northern Pacific spur line, and had been quietly dying ever since the seam played out in 1963. The county had 411 souls in it now, and a third of those lived out on isolated ranches that you could not see from any road. The town itself was one main street, 2 intersecting streets, a Sinclair gas station, a feed store, a bank, a diner called Polly's that was open from 5 to 2, a Catholic church that had not had a resident priest in 12 years, and Hollis Briggs's scrapyard out on the north edge where the asphalt gave up and turned to gravel. Jax sat up by inches. He did not wrench himself upright the way a younger man would have. He had learned, in the years since the Wadi, in the years since his back had been taken apart and put together again with titanium screws, and a length of grafted bone from his own left hip, that mornings had to be entered slowly, the way a man enters cold water, the way a man enters a building that may or may not be occupied. He swung his legs down. He felt the cold of the floorboards through the wool of his socks. He pulled on the surplus jungle boots he had bought at a vet thrift store in Billings 3 years earlier, and laced them with the unconscious precision of a man who had laced boots in the dark, in the rain, in places where a knot mattered. His military surplus jacket, faded olive drab, a Vietnam-era field jacket older than he was, hung from a wire hook he had screwed into the headliner of the cab. The cuffs of the sleeves were fraying. The brass buttons had long since been replaced with mismatched plastic ones from a sewing kit. He shrugged it on. He buttoned it from the bottom up, the way his father had taught him when he was 6 years old. His father, a Vietnam infantryman who had come home in 1971 with his own quiet ghosts and had died of an aneurysm in a Walmart parking lot at 58 without ever speaking about a single thing he had seen. Smokey watched him. The dog's eyes in the grey light were the colour of poured honey. Her muzzle had gone a little white in the last 2 years. There were 3 small scars across the bridge of her nose, faint silver lines where a fragment from a roadside bomb in 2016 had laid the skin open and ended her career in the United States Marine Corps military working dog program. She had been 4 years old then. The medics had wanted to put her down in the field. Jax had put his sidearm on the floor of the medical tent and refused to leave the table she lay on. He had not eaten for 3 days while they fought to save her left foreleg. The military had discharged them on the same week, on the same set of orders, and they had walked off the same airfield together, and they had not spent a single night apart since. He opened the driver's door, the hinge cried. He stepped down into the gravel, and Smokey followed him without command, her 3-legged at a trot gait that she had perfected in rehabilitation. The slight favouring of the left front that nobody who had not loved her for years would even notice. The cold caught him in the lungs. He breathed it in slowly, 2 counts in, 4 counts out, and the breath came back out of him as a grey plume that drifted toward the floodlight on the corner of Hollis's main shed. Hollis Briggs himself was already inside the shed. Jax could see the yellow square of his office window through the gap in the loading bay door, and he could hear the kettle whistling on the hot plate, and he could smell, faint and good, the burned coffee smell of the percolator that Hollis had been running for 31 years. Hollis was 68 and a widower and a man of approximately as many words as Jax himself, which was the only reason any kind of working arrangement between them had been possible. Hollis paid Jax in cash, $4 per intact railroad tie delivered, $6 for a tie with the date nail still in it, $8 for the rare oak ties from before 1940. He did not ask Jax where he slept. He did not ask Jax where he ate. He had once, only once, on a January morning when the temperature had hit 32 below, walked out to the GMC and laid an army wool blanket on the hood of the truck without a word, and walked back inside, and had never mentioned it again. Jax did not enter the shed. He never entered the shed before he had worked. That was a rule he had set for himself the first week. He owed Hollis a load of ties before he owed himself a cup of coffee. He fired up the GMC, the engine catching on the 3rd turn, and he let it warm for 2 full minutes, the way the old straight 6 wanted to be warmed. Smokey leapt up into the cab through the open driver's door without being told. She settled on the passenger side, her muzzle pointed forward, her ears forward, on duty. The drive out to the abandoned spur was 4 miles north of town along a frost-heaved Blacktop County road that the state had stopped grading sometime around 2018. The road climbed slowly up out of the river bottom and into the low rolling hills of bunchgrass and sage. The headlights cut a tunnel through the grey. He passed 3 ranch gates, all of them padlocked. He passed the burned-out shell of a Cenex card lock that had gone out of business in the 90s. He passed the wooden Whitlock Homestead sign at the 4-mile mark, weathered to silver, leaning at 12 degrees off vertical, its hand-routed letters worn nearly smooth. a sign he had read every workday for the better part of 2 years without ever once thinking about the family it belonged to. The spur itself was not on any current map. It had been built in 1906 to serve the Coleridge mine and a private spur to the Whitlock cattle operation, and it had been formally abandoned by the Northern Pacific in 1973, and the last set of rails had been pulled in 1981. What remained was a long pale ribbon of compacted ballast and rotted timber running along the eastern edge of the old Whitlock land, running through a slough where the ground stayed soft even in winter, running out into a stand of cottonwoods, and running eventually into nothing at all. The railroad ties along this stretch were the ones Jack salvaged. They were oak, and they were old, and they had been laid when his great-grandfather was still a young man in Kentucky. He parked at the same pull-out he always parked at. He killed the engine, he stepped down. The cold out here, away from the buildings of town, away from the streetlights, was a different and cleaner cold. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, a thin band of pewter behind the silhouettes of the cottonwoods. He could hear, very faintly, the river running under its skin of new ice a half-mile to the west. He could smell the iron smell of the frozen ground, and the sweet rotted smell of the creosote in the timbers, and the small bright smell of crushed sage where Smoky had stepped down into the bunch grass. He worked the way he had worked every morning for 2 years. He carried his short pry bar in his right hand, and his 8-pound sledge over his right shoulder. He carried the leather-palmed canvas gloves in the pocket of his jacket. Smoky paced beside him at heel, her nose working the air, her ears never still. He picked his first tie. He set the chisel end of the pry bar against the spike head. He raised the sledge. He brought it down, twice, to seat the bar, and once more to drive the spike. The sound of steel on steel rolled out across the rail bed and was eaten by the cold. The work was hard, and the work was monotonous, and the work was, in its own narrow way, the only thing that kept him alive. He had learned in the long bad year after his discharge that the body had to be tired before the mind would let go of the night. He had learned, in the longer year after that any work which paid in cash and asked no questions was a kind of grace. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that he was no longer the man his wife had married. He had learned this slowly, the way a man learns he is going grey, by the accumulation of small evidences over a long time. Her name had been Cassidy. He did not say it aloud any more, not even to Smoky. They had married when he was 22 and she was 20 in a courthouse in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 3 weeks before his second deployment. She had been a nursing student. She had been bright and fast and impatient with weakness. She had lasted faithfully through the second deployment and the third and the fourth. The fifth deployment had been the one that broke him in the wadi outside Sangin, and the surgery had been in Germany, and the rehab had been at Walter Reed in Bethesda, and she had come the first month, and then less, and then not at all. He had not blamed her. He still did not blame her. He had come back from Walter Reed 15 months later with 2 duffels and a discharged dog, and he had driven a rental car from the airport in Helena out to the small house they had bought together in Bozeman. And he had found the locks changed and a manila envelope taped to the front door with his name on it in her handwriting. Inside the envelope had been an uncontested divorce filed in his absence by a Bozeman lawyer who had cited his medical condition as evidence of his inability to be a present spouse. Inside the envelope had been a quitclaim on the house he had bought with combat pay. Inside the envelope had been the records of the joint savings account, drawn down to a balance of $14.61 over the previous 9 months. Inside the envelope had been a typed letter from Cassidy, 2 paragraphs long, that had said the marriage had ended on the day he had stopped being the man she married, and that she wished him healing. Inside the envelope had been her wedding band, taped to the bottom of the page. He had stood on that porch for a long time. Smoky had sat at his right knee, and she had not moved. The neighbour across the street, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Henning, had come out to her mailbox, had seen him, had gone inside without speaking, and had pulled her curtains. He had folded the papers into the breast pocket of his jacket. He had walked back to the rental car. He had driven east. He had been driving east in one form or another ever since. The family that was left to him was a brother in San Diego and a sister in Tampa, and neither of them had answered the third phone call. He had stopped trying after the fourth. He understood now that they had not stopped loving him. He understood that they did not know what to do with him. He understood that this distinction did not in any practical sense matter. The town of Coleridge Junction, when he had drifted into it on a tank of gas and $47, had been the place where the GMC had finally needed a new starter, and where Hollis Briggs had been the only man within 60 miles willing to look at it. Hollis had looked at the truck, and then he had looked at Jax, and then he had looked at the dog. He had said, "I got ties needs pulling out at the old spur, $4 apiece. You bring 'em in, I'll sell 'em as landscape timber down to Billings." He had said this without looking up from the engine block. He had not said welcome. He had not said how long. He had simply said the thing, and Jax had nodded, and that had been the entirety of the negotiation that had kept Jax Harlan and Smokey alive for the last 26 months. The town itself had been less generous. He had felt it first at the Sinclair when he had gone in for coffee his second week, and the woman behind the counter had counted his change onto the counter without putting it into his palm. He had felt it at the diner the one time he had tried to eat a hot meal there, when the table next to him had emptied and not been refilled. He had felt it most clearly from a small group of younger men who drank Bud Light in the parking lot of the gas station every afternoon, and who had taken to calling him, at first under their breath and then to his face, the picker. The leader of that group was a sandy-haired man in his late 20s named Wade Lacey, the son of the assistant manager of the bank, a young man who had never been further east than Rapid City, and who had decided by some private logic that Jax would never understand, that the gaunt veteran who slept in his truck was a personal affront. Wade had thrown a quarter at his back once, the previous summer, in the gravel lot of the Sinclair. The coin had struck Jax between the shoulder blades. Smokey had turned with her teeth showing for the first and only time Jax had ever seen her show them on civilian soil, and Jax had put his hand on her collar and had said very quietly, "Stand down, soldier," and Smokey had stood down. Wade had laughed. The laugh had been the laugh of a man who had read the dog's discipline as the dog's weakness. Jax had not corrected him. He had picked up the quarter and put it in the donation jar at the register and walked out. There had been worse moments. There had been the morning at Polly's diner when a young mother had come in with her little girl, and the little girl had pointed at Jax in the booth in the back, and had said in the perfectly clear voice of a 4-year-old, "Mama, why does that man smell like the woods?" And the mother had said, "Sweetheart, do not look at him," and had pulled the child to a different table. The mother had not been cruel. The mother had been afraid. The little girl had craned her neck back over her mother's shoulder, and had looked at Smokey for a long time, and Smokey had looked back, and the dog's tail had thumped twice against the booth bench in the small private way she greeted children. The little girl had smiled. The mother had not seen. Jax had not gone back to Polly's after that. Through all of it, every season, every cold morning, and every harder night, Smokey had been there. She slept against his stomach when the temperature dropped below 20. She lay across his legs when his back seized up. She woke him at 3:11 in the morning by some private clock she carried inside her. 2 minutes before the worst of the dreams would have taken him over, she walked the perimeter of the truck twice every night before she settled. She had never in 9 years asked him for anything she had not earned 10 times over. The freight on the active line gave its second horn of the morning far away now, 4 miles south, and Jax did not flinch. He set his pry bar against another spike. He raised the sledge. He brought it down. The sun came up over the ridge to the east in a low orange line, and the frost on the railbed lit up like ground glass. And Smokey, 20 feet down the line at the edge of the slough, lifted her muzzle into the wind and stood very still, her ears forward, her body alert, her amber eyes fixed on something in the soft frozen ground that no human being in Coleridge Junction had ever seen. By 11 o'clock that morning, Jax had pulled 14 ties and stacked them in the bed of the GMC, and the small of his back was a slow band of fire that he registered the way he registered the weather, as a fact rather than a complaint. He drove the load back to the scrapyard. Hollis came out of the shed in his canvas coat and his greasy ball cap, and walked once around the bed of the truck without speaking, the way he always did, counting. He took a folded wad of bills out of the inside pocket of the coat, and licked his thumb, and counted off 4 20s and a 10, and held them out. Good ones today, Hollis said. Date nail in 2 of 'em. Take it to 90. He pulled out another 10. Jax took the bills and folded them in half once and put them in the breast pocket of his jacket without counting. Hollis nodded. Smoky thumped her tail against the gravel. Hollis bent down with the slow, careful motion of a man whose knees had been worn out by 42 winters of walking on cold concrete. And he scratched, briefly, the bone behind Smoky's ear, and he straightened. Banks open till 1 on a Saturday, Hollis said. Wouldn't carry that much on you walking around. It was the closest thing to advice the man had ever given him, and Jax understood it for what it was. He nodded once. Hollis went back inside the shed, and Jax climbed into the cab, and Smoky climbed in after him, and they drove the 7 blocks down the main street to the first Yellowstone bank of Coleridge Junction. The bank was the only 2-story building on the main street, a square brick affair built in 1908 with a stone lintel above the door that read, in chiselled serif, Honest Bank for Honest Folk. The lintel had been ironic for at least 60 of its 117 years. Jax parked at the curb. He told Smoky to wait, and Smoky settled herself with her muzzle on her paws on the passenger seat, and Jax walked into the bank with his $90 folded in his pocket and his jacket buttoned to the throat. The lobby was warm and smelled of floor wax and old paper. There were 2 teller windows. The window on the left was occupied by a young woman in her 20s who was checking her phone under the counter. The window on the right was occupied by an old woman in a wool coat the colour of dried lavender, a coat that was at least 30 years old and had been brushed that morning to lift the nap. The old woman was very small and very straight. Her hair was white and pinned. Her gloves, set on the counter beside her, were good leather gloves that had been mended at the seams. Jax took his place in the line behind her. He stood the way he had been trained to stand at any counter or checkpoint, 3 feet back, hands visible, eyes on the middle distance, ears taking in everything. The man on the bank side of the right-hand window was Marlon Corbin, the assistant manager. Jax knew the man by sight, Wade Lacey's father, a man of about 55 in a check shirt and a maroon tie, with the careful soft hands of a man who had never used them for anything heavier than a pen. Marlon was speaking to the old woman, and he was speaking in the slow, loud voice that some people use with the elderly, the voice that pretended to be patience and was actually contempt. "Mrs. Whitlock," he was saying, "I can read it to you again. But it is not going to say anything different." The notice was filed Tuesday. The 30-day cure period is what it is. I cannot extend it. The bank does not have the authority to extend it. The note is held in Billings now. Ma'am, it is out of my hands. I have been making the payments. Marlon, the old woman said. Her voice was quiet and clear, and carried the small, dry tremor of age, but none at all of weakness. I have made 41 years of payments on that note. Yes, ma'am, but the balloon came due in October. You knew about the balloon. I sat in your kitchen 4 years ago and walked you through it. I knew about it. I asked you, when we sat in my kitchen, whether the balloon could be refinanced. You said it could. You sat at my table and ate 2 pieces of my pumpkin bread and told me that any community bank in the state would refinance an $80,000 balloon on 160 acres. That was 4 years ago. Mrs. Whitlock, the market has changed. Interest rates have changed. The bank's appraiser has the property at $38,000 for the structures and the well, and the underwriter cannot. My grandfather paid $4,000 an acre for that ground in 19 and 21. Marlon, in 19 and 21. That was a fortune then. I have the deed. I have his journal. I have his. Mrs. Whitlock, Marlon said, and the word ma'am was not in this one. Please. The line. Jax watched the back of the woman's neck, the very fine white hair at the nape of it, the way it did not move when she shook her head. I have lived on that homestead for 78 years, she said. I was born in the bedroom my grandfather built. My husband is buried under the apple tree my grandfather planted. There is no line in this bank long enough for you to hurry me out of asking what my options are. The young teller on the left looked up from her phone. Marlon Corbin's mouth tightened. He glanced past Mrs. Whitlock to Jax. His eyes, when they landed on Jax, did the thing they always did. The small reflexive narrowing, the small lift at the corner of the lip, the look of a man who had been raised by his father to believe that the visible poor were a personal accusation. Sir Marlon said, looking past her, I can have Brittany cash that for you over here. The old woman did not turn. She did not move. She stood, very straight, her gloved hand resting on the counter beside her brown leather gloves. And she waited. Jax stepped slightly to the side and gave a small shake of his head. I'll wait my turn. Ma'am, he said. He said it to the back of her neck. He saw her shoulders lift, very slightly, half an inch, and settle. Thank you, she said, also to the counter. It was a small thing. It was the smallest thing. It was the first time, possibly, that anyone had said the word ma'am to her in a public place in Coleridge Junction in a long time, and the first time that anyone had stood in any public place in Coleridge Junction, in line behind Jax Harlan as if he belonged there. Marlon Corbin's mouth tightened further. He spoke to her for another 2 minutes. He did not soften. He spoke about the cure period and the auction date set for the 26th of January, and the property inspection that would be conducted on the 18th by representatives of an investment company out of Bozeman called Sage Ridge Holdings. He said the words investment company in the small reverent tone that men of his particular stripe used when speaking of money they hoped one day to be allowed to touch. He produced a pamphlet. He set it on the counter between them. The old woman did not pick it up. I will not need that, she said. I will see myself out. She turned. Her eyes were very pale blue, and they were perfectly dry, and they passed across Jax's face for a fraction of a second without recognition or apology or appeal. She walked out of the bank with her mended gloves in her left hand and her small black handbag in her right, and the brass bell on the door rang once when she pushed it open, and she was gone. Jax stepped to the right-hand window. Marlon Corbin's expression did its second small reflexive change, this one toward the imitation of professional courtesy. Mr. Harlan, he said. Cash. Please. Jax laid the $90 on the counter. Tens. 10 $10 bills. Yes. You don't want me to put it in your account. I don't have an account. You could open one today. We have a no minimum starter, checking with a debit card. $50 to start. Tens, Jax said. Please. Marlon Corbin counted out 9 tens. He counted them slowly. In the slightly louder voice he used for Jax, he pushed them across the counter. Jax put them in his breast pocket, on top of the 90 he had not yet broken. He nodded once. He turned. He walked toward the door. Through the glass, on the sidewalk across the street, he saw the small, straight back of the old woman in the lavender coat. She was standing very still on the curb. The wind, sharper than it had been at dawn, had picked up out of the north and was lifting the tail of her coat against her thin legs. He could not see her face. She was looking down at her gloves as if she were trying to remember which hand each glove went on. He pushed the bell. He stepped out into the cold. Smokey, in the GMC at the curb, was upright on the passenger seat. Her ears were forward. Her muzzle was pressed against the window glass. She was not looking at Jax. She was looking at the old woman. As Jax walked toward the truck, Smokey gave a single short whuff from deep in her chest, the quiet sound she made when something on a patrol had moved out of the expected pattern. Jax stopped at the driver's door. He did not open it. He looked at the dog. The dog looked at the woman on the sidewalk, finally pulled on her left glove. She started to walk in the direction of the county road. Her steps were short and careful on the iced concrete. Jax glanced east, the way she was walking, and he thought, the way a soldier always thought, in distances the wooden Whitlock sign at the 4-mile mark on the county road, the straight-backed old woman in the cloth coat. The temperature 21 degrees and falling. The wind out of the north at 12 to 15, the probability that this woman, on foot in those shoes, was going to make it the 4 miles home before her body gave out on her. The probability was 0. He did the math twice. The probability was 0. Smoky whuffed again. She stood up on the passenger seat. She did not bark. She placed one front paw, very deliberately, against the inside of the door. "All right?" "Soldier," Jack said. Under his breath, "All right." He opened the driver's door. He pulled the truck off the curb in a slow, careful U-turn that put him on the woman's side of the street 50 feet ahead of her. He rolled down the passenger window. Smoky moved to the bench. Making room, Mrs. Whitlock saw the truck. Her face did not change. She kept walking. She did not slow. Jax matched her pace at a crawl. He leaned across the bench. "Ma'am," he said, through the open window, "I don't mean any disrespect. It is 21 degrees with a north wind. You have got to be 4 miles from home. I have walked further in worse." She did not look at the truck. Her chin was up. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sure you have." "So have I." He paused. "I'm headed out the county road anyway. If you'd consider the favour of letting me drop you at your gate, I would be in your debt." He said the last part the way his father had once said it to a black widow at a church potluck in 1978. A woman who had not wanted to accept a casserole for fear of being thought needful. The phrasing of the offer had mattered then, and Jax thought it might matter now. The old woman stopped walking. She turned. She looked for the first time into the cab of the truck. Her pale blue eyes moved across Jax, across his beard, across the worn olive jacket, across the dark lean dog on the bench seat. Her gaze rested on Smoky longest. Smoky met her gaze, and Smoky's tail thumped, exactly once against the vinyl. "That is a beautiful dog, Mrs. Whitlock said. "Yes. Ma'am, she is—" "What is her name?" "Smoky." "Smoky," she tested the word. "Is she yours?" "We were partners." "Ma'am." She was a Marine Corps working dog. 8 years in. She came home with me in 2016. Something moved in the old woman's face. It moved very quickly and was put away very quickly. She pulled her good leather glove off her right hand finger by finger, and she stepped to the truck, and she held her bare hand palm up through the window, level with Smoky's muzzle, in the old proper way of a person who had been raised around working dogs. Smoky leaned her muzzle into the offered palm. Smoky exhaled once against the woman's wrist. "Mrs." Whitlock's mouth moved. She looked, for 1 second, at the floor of the cab. She put the glove back on. "My grandfather kept shepherds," she said. "He had a male called Major. I have not put my hand on a German shepherd in 51 years. "Yes, ma'am." "I am not in the habit," she said, "of accepting rides from men I do not know." "No, ma'am. You shouldn't be." "And yet I find that I am extremely cold." "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, the way she had nodded at the counter in the bank. She walked around the front of the truck. Jax leaned across and opened the passenger door. Smoky moved in one fluid economical motion to the floor of the cab, leaving the seat for the woman. The old woman climbed up with the slow, careful movement of a woman whose hip was not what it had been in 1960, and she settled, and she folded her gloved hands in her lap, and she closed the door. The cab was suddenly very small and warm, and smelled faintly of pumpkin bread and lavender water and dog. "Eleanor Whitlock," she said. "Most everybody calls me Nellie. I have not asked anybody to call me Mrs. Whitlock since my husband died. Except in banks. Jax Harlan." "Mr. Harlan." "Jax is fine." "Ma'am." "Then Nellie is fine." "Jax." He pulled the truck out into the road. The defrost was working. He turned the heat up 2 notches. They drove for half a mile without speaking. Smoky pressed her flank against Jax's right calf, and the heat of her body was the same metronome it had always been. "You work the old spur," Nellie said. She did not phrase it as a question. "Yes, ma'am. Hollis Briggs has me pulling ties." "I haven't been trespassing." "Ma'am, I assumed it was railroad right-of-way still, and... It was abandoned and reverted in 1978, she said. It is on Whitlock land. It has been on Whitlock land since November of 1920. My grandfather paid $4,000 an acre for the river bottom in 1921 because he believed the spur would put his cattle on a Chicago train inside 30 hours, which it did until it didn't. Ma'am, if I owe you for those ties, you do not owe me anything for the ties. Mr. Harlan, Jax. The ties were rotting into the ground. If you can sell a piece of my grandfather's heart for $4 a piece in Billings, I'm glad somebody has the use of it. He glanced at her. She was looking out the windshield. Her jaw was set in the way of a woman who would not have her dignity questioned by either bankers or strangers. They reached the wooden sign at the 4-mile mark, the sign that said, in carved letters worn nearly smooth, Whitlock 1921. He turned in. The lane was 1/4 mile long, packed dirt under the snow, a row of ancient cottonwoods on the north side. It opened, finally, into a yard. The house at the end of the lane was a single-story homestead frame house painted white 40 years ago and weathered now to the colour of bone, with a deep front porch and a stone chimney and a tin roof with a cap of fresh snow on it. Behind the house stood a small red barn that was leaning very slightly to the east, and beyond the barn stood the brown skeletons of what had once been an apple orchard. Jack stopped the truck at the bottom of the porch steps. Nellie did not move to get out. She looked at the house. She looked at it the way a person looks at the face of someone they have loved for a very long time, who is not going to be there much longer. She breathed in once, and she breathed out, and she set her gloved right hand on the dashboard for a moment to steady herself, and then she put it back in her lap. They mean to sell it, she said, to the windshield, on the 26th of January, in the lobby of that bank, to a company that will tear down the orchard and the barn and the house for the gravel under the bottom pasture. Mr. Corbin has sent his appraisers out twice. The ground I was born on will be a quarry inside 2 years. Our cemetery is on the west slope. They will move the stones. He tells me he has been very thoughtful about the stones. She paused. She was not crying. Her hands in her lap did not move. I have been a teacher for 46 years and a widow for 19. I have one nephew in Spokane who has not returned my telephone calls since 2009. I have been making the payments on my grandfather's note out of my retirement and the lease on the bottom pasture, and I have been doing it just well enough to keep ahead. And the balloon came due, and I do not have $80,000, and there is no community bank in this state, Mr. Harlan, that will lend it to a 78-year-old woman with no cosigner. She turned, finally, and looked at him. Her pale blue eyes were perfectly steady. I do not know why I'm telling you this, she said, except that you said ma'am to me in the bank, and your dog put her face in my hand, and I have not been touched by anything alive in almost 6 months. Jax did not answer for a long moment. He looked at the house. He looked at the orchard. He looked at the small red barn. He thought briefly of his own porch in Bozeman, and of Mrs. Henning across the street drawing her curtains. He thought of Cassidy's wedding band, taped to the bottom of a typed letter. He thought of his brother in San Diego. He thought of the 4 phone calls. He thought of Smokey. Smokey was sitting upright on the floor of the cab now, her amber eyes fixed on Nellie's face, her ears forward, her body still. She had not moved since the truck had stopped. She was, Jax realized, doing the thing she always did when a mission had been identified. She was waiting for the order. "Ma'am," Jax said. "Very quietly, would you allow me, between today and the 18th of January, to come around your land and see what I can see?" Nellie Whitlock did not ask what that meant. She only looked at him. She nodded. Once, the same nod she had given the bank counter, and she opened the truck door and climbed down into the cold of her own yard, and she walked, very straight, up the steps of her grandfather's porch. By Monday morning, Jax had a notebook. He had bought it that Sunday afternoon at the feed store, a small green spiral steno pad of the kind contractors used for rough estimates, and a Bic ballpoint. and he had paid for both in cash and walked out without speaking to anyone except the cashier. He had sat that night in the cab of the GMC under the floodlight in Hollis's yard, with Smokey on the bench beside him, and he had begun to organise the problem the way he would have organised a forward operating base. He wrote at the top of the first page, in the small neat block printing he had learned in basic training, Whitlock. Beneath it he wrote, Balloon 80K, Awection 26 Jan, Inspection 18 Jan, Developer Sage Ridge Holdings Bozeman. He wrote Allays. He left the line blank. He wrote Enemies. He wrote, beneath that, Marlon Corbin. He had been given missions on shorter timelines and with worse intel. He had also been given missions in which he had the support of a team and a chain of command and a set of rules of engagement that defined what was permitted. He had none of those things now. He had $90 in his breast pocket. He had a 4-mile circuit of the old spur to the northeast. He had a dog. He had whatever was left of his ability, after 8 years of slow erosion, to walk into rooms full of people who did not want him there, and to do so without losing the thread. He started, on Monday, with the courthouse. The Coleridge County Courthouse was a 1-story sandstone building with a peeling plaster ceiling and a permanent smell of mimeograph fluid that no one had explained to Jax and that he did not ask about. He walked into the records office at 8:30 in the morning. He set his notebook on the high counter. He removed his cap. He waited for the clerk, a woman in her 60s named Doris, who wore reading glasses on a chain, and who had been a cashier at Polly's diner before her husband died. "Help you," Doris said. She did not say it as a question. "Ma'am," Jack said, "I'd like to see the deed history on the Whitlock parcel, and the abandoned right-of-way for the old Coleridge spur, if those records still exist." Doris's eyes lifted from his beard to his eyes, very slowly. She did not move. "You family," she said. "You a Whitlock?" "No." "Ma'am." "You a lawyer?"
No.
"Ma'am." "You representing anybody?" "No." "Ma'am." "I'm representing myself." "There a reason you want them?" "Then." Jax did not blink. He did not change the angle of his shoulders. He had stood at this kind of counter, in this kind of courthouse, in this kind of small western town, all his life. He had grown up in Idaho. He had walked into rooms where his last name had been a key, and he had walked into rooms where his last name had been a problem, and he had learned, somewhere around the age of 14, that the only thing that worked at any of these counters was the precise truth, delivered short. "I'm helping Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "She gave me leave." Doris looked at him for a long second, then she opened a drawer beneath the counter and brought out a key on a brass tag and walked back to the records vault and returned, 8 minutes later, with 2 heavy linen-bound ledgers and 1 rolled survey plat. She set them on the counter without comment. She did not charge him. He understood, looking at her, that she had known Nellie Whitlock all her life, and that the small soft middle of Doris was, in this moment, and perhaps in this moment alone, a place where the lever might be set. "Reading room is to your left," Doris said. "Photographs are $1/4 apiece. I lock up at 4. "Yes." "Ma'am." "Thank you." "You spell your name with an X." "Yes." "Ma'am." "Jax." "All right then." "Mr. Harlan." He spent 5 hours in the reading room. He copied, by hand, the chain of title on the Whitlock parcel from 1894 to the present. He copied the relevant easements. He copied the formal abandonment notice for the Northern Pacific Spur, dated September 11th, 1973, and the reversion notice that had transferred the right-of-way back to the Whitlock estate, dated August 2nd, 1978. He copied the original survey plat of the spur drawn by hand in 1906, signed by a railroad surveyor named E.M. Lloyd, with an embossed Northern Pacific seal in the lower corner. He copied the names and dates from the manifest of the original Coleridge Spur Charter. He found something he did not understand on the survey plat. It was a small notation, in pencil, at the eastern edge of the slough. It was in a different hand than the rest of the plat. It was in lighter pencil, and it had been made later, and it read, Train No. 7 Vanish 11 April 1923, nor recovery. He copied the notation exactly. He underlined the date. He left the courthouse at 1:45 with 13 pages of notes and 4 photographs and walked. In the bright, cold sunlight, the 2 blocks down to the Coleridge County Historical Society. The Historical Society lived in the front room of the old Carnegie Library, which had not been a functioning library since 1996. The building was open 3 afternoons a week. The volunteer archivist was a man named Doc Pemberton. Doc Pemberton had been the only veterinarian in Coleridge County for 41 years. He had retired in 2014. He was 81 years old, gnomish, with a perfectly bald skull and a white beard down to his collarbone, and a pair of half-frame reading glasses that he wore on the very tip of his nose. He had been Smokey's vet twice in the previous 2 years. He had once refused to let Jax pay him for a deep abscess on her left hindquarter, on the grounds, he had said, that he had received his veterinary degree on the GI Bill, and it was about time he settled up. Doc looked up from a filing cabinet when Jax pushed open the library door. The bell jingled. Smokey, who had been left in the truck on the courthouse lawn for the morning, padded in beside Jax now. Doc smiled with his entire face. Sergeant, he said. To the dog. What brings the 2 of you to the deep archives? Sir, Jax said. And he laid the photograph of the survey plat on the desk. And he tapped, with his finger, the pencil notation at the eastern edge of the slough. Doc looked. Doc adjusted the glasses on the end of his nose. He read the notation. He looked up. The smile had gone out of his face, but it had not been replaced by a frown. It had been replaced by something more careful. Where did you get this? Doc said. County records. The original Spur survey. And what is your interest? Mrs. Whitlock, Jax said. Doc was quiet for a long moment. He set down the magnifying glass he had been holding. He removed his half-frame readers, polished them on the tail of his cardigan, and set them back on his nose. Sit down, Jax, he said. I'm going to make us a pot of bad coffee and tell you a story I have been carrying for a long time, and which I believe a man like you can carry a piece of. The story Doc Pemberton told him in the next 40 minutes, at a folding table in the front room of the old Carnegie Library, with Smokey lying across the toes of both their boots and a percolator hissing on the radiator, was the story of the Whitlock shame. It was a story Jax had never heard, because nobody in Coleridge Junction had told him a story about anything in 2 years. It went like this. In the spring of 1923, on the 11th of April, a private train of 2 cars and a tender had departed from a siding on the Whitlock Spur, bound for the main line junction at Coleridge, and from there for the east. The locomotive was a small Baldwin 440. The engineer's name was Henrik Olsen. The fireman and brakeman, an unusual second crewman for so small a train, was a man named Walter Whitlock, the only son of the homesteader Augustus Whitlock and the heir to the Whitlock cattle operation. The cargo on that train, manifested in the Northern Pacific records as miscellaneous metallurgy, had been in actuality a private shipment of milled gold ingots from a Whitlock-owned placer claim in the Beartooth foothills, totaling, in the dollars of the day, just over $432,000. In modern dollars, Doc said, his eyes steady behind the half-frame readers, the cargo would value, conservatively, at around $41 million. Walter Whitlock, his engineer Henrik Olsen, and the train had vanished on the night of the 11th of April 1923 between the Whitlock Spur and the Coleridge Junction, a distance of 3 1/4 miles in the middle of the worst spring flood in the recorded history of the Yellowstone Valley. There had been no recovery. The river had been over its banks for 9 days. The slough had risen by 22 feet. The ground for half a mile in any direction had been a single sheet of standing brown water, and when the water had finally gone down in late April, The rail bed itself had been buried under 3 to 9 feet of new silt across most of the eastern section. And the Whitlock train had simply not been there. The locomotive had not been there. The cars had not been there. The men had not been there. The gold had not been there. The Northern Pacific had run a recovery survey. The Whitlock family had run a recovery survey. A Pinkerton agency out of Chicago, hired by the family, had run a recovery survey. None of them had found the train. By 1925, the official Northern Pacific Incident Report had concluded that the train had derailed and been buried in the silt of the slough, and that recovery would be impossible without dredging an area too large to be economically justified. The insurer had paid out a partial settlement to the family, which had covered the loss of the locomotive only, the gold having been carried as private cargo and uninsured. And then, Doc said, the rumours started. The rumours, Doc said, had started in 1926, 3 years after the disappearance, when a man drinking in a saloon in Spokane had claimed to have known Walter Whitlock and Henrik Olsen, and to have seen them alive in San Francisco the previous year. The man had been, on closer inspection, a drunk and a liar, and he had recanted within a week, but the seed had been planted. By 1930, half of Coleridge Junction had quietly come to believe that Walter Whitlock and Henrik Olsen had derailed the train deliberately on the 11th of April 1923, that they had buried the gold somewhere in the slough, and that they had walked out of the country with their pockets full and started new lives elsewhere. There was no evidence of any of this, Doc said. There never was. The men's families were destroyed. Henrik Olsen's widow, Astrid, was driven out of the county by gossip in 1928 and was never heard from again. Augustus Whitlock, Walter's father, who had been a deacon in the Lutheran church and a county commissioner, lost his civic standing inside 2 years and died of a heart attack in 1931 at the age of 58. The Whitlock land was sold off in pieces through the Depression to pay off lawyers Augustus had hired to clear his son's name. And what was left at the end was the homestead and the river bottom and the family graveyard, and that was what passed to Walter's younger brother Cyrus, and that was what passed to Cyrus's daughter, Eleanor. Doc paused. He took off his glasses and set them on the table. Nellie has carried that whisper her entire life, he said. Her grandfather was the brother of a thief in this town. Her father was the son of the brother of a thief. She was the granddaughter and the niece, and there was not a year of her childhood when she was not reminded of it by some old man at the feed store, be some old woman after church. She married a Whitlock cousin, Michael, partly because the Whitlocks were the only family in 3 counties who did not flinch at the name, and every sale of every quarter section since 1923 has been a sale at a discount. Because the land is haunted and the family is shamed, that is why she is in the position she is in. Jax, that is why $80,000 she does not have is going to take her grandfather's homestead. Doc put the readers back on. He looked at Jax. He looked at the dog at his feet. There is nothing buried in that slough, Doc said. Northern Pacific looked, Pinkertons looked. The Army Corps of Engineers regraded the eastern half of it in 1961, and they did not find a single rail spike. There is no train down there. There is only 101 years of poison. Jax drove out to the homestead that afternoon at 3. He found Nellie Whitlock in the kitchen of her grandfather's house, in a black wool sweater and a heavy denim apron, baking pumpkin bread. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. She set a slice in front of him on a chipped blue china plate. She poured coffee from a percolator into a mug that had a small enamel chip on the rim. She did not ask him what he had learned. She waited, he told her, quietly and exactly what Doc Pemberton had told him. Her hands, holding her mug, did not shake. She listened to all of it. She nodded, twice, at the parts she had heard her whole life. She did not interrupt him. When he finished, she set the mug down very carefully on the cutting board. Walter was 26 when the train went down, she said. My grandfather Cyrus was 19. Cyrus told me, on the porch of this house when I was 9 years old, that his older brother had not been a thief. He told me Walter had been the kindest man he had ever known, and that Walter had once carried a half-frozen ranch hand 4 miles in a blizzard on his back, and that Walter was the kind of man who could not have stolen a peppermint stick from a candy jar without writing the storekeeper a letter of confession the next morning. She paused. My grandfather died in 1981. He died believing his brother was a hero, and he died unable to prove it to anyone. My father died in 1996 believing the same thing. My husband, who took the Whitlock name when he married me, died in 2006 believing the same thing. I have believed it my entire life. She looked at Jax. Her eyes were perfectly steady. I have nothing to give you. Jax Harlan. I have half a loaf of pumpkin bread and a porch, and a deed that will not be mine in 7 weeks. But if you're asking my permission to walk that slough with your dog between now and the 18th of January, I'm giving it to you. Yes, ma'am, Jax said. He did not say what Doc had said about the futility of the Northern Pacific search and the Pinkerton search and the Army Corps regrading. He did not say it because he had not in his life ever been a man who placed much weight on what other men had failed to find. He had been a man who walked the line one more time. He had been a man whose dog had walked the line one more time after him, and who had, in an embarrassing number of cases, found the thing he had failed to find. He drove back to town as the light was going. He filled the GMC with gas at the Sinclair. He went inside to pay. Wade Lacey and 2 of his friends were standing in the lot when he came out. Wade was leaning against the front fender of his lifted pickup with a tall can of Bud Light in his right hand. He was 28, and his face was already getting the soft, slack look that small-town men get when they spend their evenings drinking in gravel lots. And his eyes had the particular small, mean light that they always had when Jax came into his orbit. Picker, Wade said. Heard you was at the bank Saturday. Jax did not stop walking. He did not slow. Smoky, at heel. Did not slow. Heard you was driving Nellie Whitlock around, Wade said. Jax reached the door of the GMC. You leave that old woman alone. Pick her. Hear me. My daddy says her place is going up on the block in January. Her place ain't none of your business. Jax opened the door. Smokey leapt up past him. Jax climbed in. He closed the door. He rolled down the window halfway. He looked out at Wade Lacey across the cold air. Mr. Lacey, he said. Quietly. He had never used the man's name to his face before. If you have got something to say about Mrs. Whitlock, you can say it to her face. If you have got something to say to me, you can say it now, and I will hear you. Wade flushed. The 2 friends shifted. Smoky, on the bench, was very still. Her ears were forward. She did not growl. She did not need to. The second friend dropped his eyes to the gravel. Wade tried to laugh. It did not entirely come out as a laugh. I'm just saying, pick her. Stand down, Mr. Lacey, Jax said. I have a long week ahead of me. He pulled the GMC out of the gas station. He drove the 7 blocks back to Hollis's yard. He parked under the floodlight. He sat in the cab in the dark for a long time, with Smokey against his side, and he opened his green steno pad, and on the page marked Allies, he wrote, in the same neat block printing, 3 lines. Doris Courthouse. Doc Historical Society. Hollis. Then he closed the notebook. He laid it on the dash. He rested his hand on Smokey's shoulder. The freight horn at the southern crossing began its 3 long pulls and 1 short, and Jax breathed. 2 counts in, 4 counts out, and the dog pressed her warm side against him in the dark. The weather turned on Wednesday. A storm pushed down out of Alberta on Tuesday night, dragged itself across the High Line on a 30-knot wind, and dropped 14 inches of dry powder on Coleridge Junction between 2 in the morning and 10 in the morning on Wednesday the 17th of December. The temperature, behind the front, fell to 14 below by sundown. The wind, which had not stopped, made it feel like 38 below on the open ground out by the slough. Jax kept working. He had no choice in this, and he had stopped pretending that he did. He had, by Wednesday morning, 4 weeks until the 18th of January, and he had nothing yet to show Nellie Whitlock for any of his hours. He had walked the slough with Smokey for 3 full days. He had walked it from the apple orchard to the cottonwoods, and from the cottonwoods to the eastern fence, and from the eastern fence back along the rail bed to the place where the spur had been pulled in 1981. He had walked it in a grid pattern, the way he had been trained to walk a contested area in the Corringal in 2008, 10 paces parallel, 10 paces back, always within hand signal distance of the dog. Smokey had quartered ahead of him on her 3-legged trot, her nose to the ground at the start of every line, her amber eyes lifting every 50 yards to confirm his position. She had found nothing on Sunday, she had found nothing on Monday, she had found nothing on Tuesday until late in the afternoon, when she had stopped abruptly on the eastern lip of the slough, 22 yards north of the small wooden bridge where the rail bed crossed the drainage. She had stood on that spot for a long time. She had not dug, she had not whined, she had simply stood, and her nose had worked, and her ears had been forward, and Jax had marked the spot in his green notebook with a small careful triangle and a compass bearing. He had asked her, very quietly, "What is it?" "Soldier." She had looked up at him. She had thumped her tail, exactly once, against the frozen reeds. She had walked, deliberately, 3 steps to her left, and she had stood again, and her muzzle had pointed down at the ground, at a slightly different angle, into the soft black earth at the edge of the slough where the cattails had collapsed in the first hard frost. He had marked that spot too. Then the storm had come. By Wednesday at noon, the slough was buried. The rail bed was gone. The cattails were under a smooth, pale white blanket that erased every contour of the eastern edge. He could not have walked the grid if he had wanted to. He could barely stay upright in the wind. He worked anyway. He pulled 3 ties that morning out of the section where the snow was thinnest, and he stacked them in the bed of the GMC, and his hands inside the canvas gloves went numb at the 2nd tie, and then began to burn at the 3rd tie in the way that hands burn at 14 below, before they stop being able to feel anything. And he stopped, and he stood by the truck, and he flexed his fingers inside the gloves, and he let himself breathe out for a long count. Smokey stood at his right hip. The wind was lifting the long guard hairs of her coat. She was watching him. "All right," he said, to the dog. "All right. We get inside." He drove back to Hollis's yard. He sold the 3 ties. Hollis, in his canvas coat, took one look at Jax's face and at the dog, and reached behind him into the office, and produced a thermos and unscrewed the cap, and poured a cup of coffee that was so black it was almost green, and Jax took it without speaking, and Hollis put a chunk of jerky on the floor for Smokey, and neither of them said a word about any of it. He drove out to the homestead at 1 o'clock with the heat blasting and Smokey on the bench. Nellie was waiting at the door. She had seen the truck on the lane. She had a soup pot on the stove and a fire in the parlour stove and a grandfather Afghan folded on the kitchen chair nearest the heat, and she did not make any kind of speech about any of it. She set a bowl of bean soup with smoked ham hock in front of him. She set a smaller bowl of plain ground beef and rice on the kitchen floor for Smokey. She poured coffee. She sat down across the table. "You will not work the slough today," she said. "You will not work it tomorrow. Mr. Harlan, the wind chill is 40 below. Yes, ma'am. You will sit in this kitchen and eat this soup, and your dog will sleep in front of that stove. And tomorrow I will drive you in my own truck to Doc Pemberton's house, and you will see the rest of what he has. Because what he showed you was not all of it." Jax looked up. "Doc telephoned me last night," she said. "He said he had been thinking. He said there was a thing he had been keeping in a box in his attic, a thing he had not shown to anyone in 28 years, and that he believed, given recent developments, that the thing should now be shown." She paused. Her hands, on the kitchen table, were folded. "Jax," she said, and the name was small and soft in her mouth. "My grandfather kept a journal. The journal does not exist, or rather, the part of it from 1923 has not existed since 1928. My grandfather Cyrus burned the pages in this kitchen when he was 24 years old. In a moment of rage at the town, Doc Pemberton has the journal his father kept. His father was the original veterinarian here, Doc Sr., and he was on the 11 April recovery party. There are things in his father's daybook, Doc says, that nobody has ever looked at, because they were the daybook of a country vet, and nobody thought a country vet would have anything to say about a missing train. She watched his face. "I want you to see it," she said, "after you eat my soup. After your dog has warmed her bones, I want you to see what Doc Pemberton has been carrying." He ate the soup. He had not eaten a homemade meal indoors at a real table in 8 months. He did not realize until he was halfway through the bowl that his hands were shaking very slightly. Nellie did not comment. She refilled the bowl when it was empty. Smokey lay in front of the parlour stove with her muzzle on her front paws and her amber eyes half closed, the very tip of her tail moving once every half-minute against the floor planks. He slept for 45 minutes with his head against the wood of the kitchen wall. He did not mean to sleep. He had not slept in the daytime indoors in 7 years. When he came back up out of it, the kitchen was warm and quiet, and Nellie was reading at the other end of the table with her half-frame readers on, and Smokey was at his feet, and his coffee was still warm in the mug because she had refilled it. He thanked her by standing. He did not say the word. That night back at Hollis's, the wind tore at the GMC for 9 hours. He lay against Smokey and he did not sleep, and he listened to the wind, and somewhere, very far back in his head, the wind became another wind. The wind across a ridge in the Hindu Kush in 2011, the wind under which Reyes had been walking ahead of him in the wadi, and Jax breathed 2 in and 4 out, 2 in and 4 out, until the wind was the wind in Montana again, and Smokey, who had not slept either, pressed her chest against his ribs without waking, and they made it through the way they had made it through 8,000 other nights. Thursday morning came pale and clear and brutally cold. Nellie picked him up at Hollis's yard at 8 in her own truck, a green 1988 Ford F-150 that her husband Michael had bought new and that she had kept running by herself for 19 years. They drove the 4 miles into town with the heater on full and Smokey on the bench between them. They parked at Doc Pemberton's house, a small clapboard on Birch Street. Doc was waiting on the front step in his cardigan and his half-frame readers. He took them upstairs to the back bedroom, which was lined floor to ceiling with archival boxes. He went to a box on the 3rd shelf. He brought down a small leather-bound book. He set it on the desk. It was the daybook of a country vet. It was the daybook specifically of Howard Pemberton DVM, who had practiced veterinary medicine in Coleridge County between 1909 and 1946, and who had been called out in the morning of the 12th of April 1923 to the home of Astrid Olsen, the wife of Henrik Olsen, the engineer. The Olsen family had kept a small dairy. Astrid had had a dairy cow that was 3 weeks late on a calf. Doc Pemberton Sr. had spent the morning of the 12th pulling a stillborn calf out of an exhausted cow in the Olsen barn, while the recovery search for the lost train was being organised at the Northern Pacific section house in town. In his daybook, on the 12th of April 1923, in a careful hand in violet ink, Doc Pemberton Sr. had written this paragraph. "Mrs. Olsen is in the barn with me through the calf. She is very calm considering. She tells me that her husband Henrik came home Tuesday evening before he left out, and that he sat at her kitchen table and did write a letter to his brother in Minneapolis, and that he sealed it in an envelope and gave it to her, and told her to mail it on Thursday no matter what. He told her that the cargo on the train was Whitlock private gold, that it had been kept off the manifest at the request of Mr. Augustus Whitlock for tax reasons of which Henrik did not approve, that Henrik considered Walter Whitlock to be the most honest man he had ever worked alongside, and that Henrik was carrying the gold east personally as a favour to Walter and to Augustus, and that he would deliver it to a Minneapolis bank on Friday morning. Mrs. Olsen mailed the letter Thursday morning in spite of the storm. She has not had a reply. She showed me the carbon Henrik left her of the letter. I read it. It is in his hand. I am writing this here because nobody at the section house is asking me anything, and because if I do not write it down, it will not be written down." There was a silence in the small upstairs bedroom. "My father," Doc Pemberton said quietly, "wrote 2 more entries about it that month. No one ever asked him for a deposition. The letter Astrid Olsen mailed to her brother-in-law in Minneapolis was returned 3 months later. Undelivered, the brother-in-law had died of influenza in 1918. Astrid Olsen left the county in 1928, and we never heard from her. My father kept her carbon copy of the letter in this same box. It is, to my knowledge, still here. He opened a small accordion file inside the larger box. He took out a single piece of yellowed onion skin paper folded into thirds. He laid it on the desk. The paper was a carbon. The typed letters were faint but legible. The signature at the bottom, in pencil, was H. Owlson. The letter said, in 8 short paragraphs, that the cargo Walter Whitlock and Henrik Olsen were carrying on train number 7 on the 11th of April 1923 was a private placer gold shipment, weight 218 pounds, value $432,000, owned in full by the estate of Augustus Whitlock, and intended for deposit at the First Bank of Minneapolis as inheritance principal for the future use of Walter Whitlock's children. The letter said that Augustus Whitlock had asked them to keep it off the official Northern Pacific Manifest for reasons of state property tax assessment. The letter said that Henrik Olsen, an honest man with a wife and 3 small children, had agreed to do this thing because he trusted Walter Whitlock with his life. The letter said that if anything happened on the run, Mrs. Olsen was to know that her husband had not been a thief. Nellie Whitlock sat down in the desk chair very slowly. She did not speak for almost 3 minutes. She held the carbon in her gloved hands. Her gloves did not shake, but the hand inside the glove was, Jax could see, a different thing entirely. Finally, she said, "Why did your father not show this?" In 1923. In 1925. Ever. Doc removed his readers. He cleaned them on the cardigan again. He put them back on. He looked at Nellie with something old and tired and ashamed. Augustus Whitlock would not let him, Doc said. My father went to Augustus with this carbon in May of 23. Augustus was already a broken man. Augustus told my father that if the letter were made public, the tax fraud would be on his head, and the tax fraud would forfeit what remained of his land to the state, and he would lose everything that remained for Cyrus and for Cyrus's children. He asked my father to hold the letter until he himself died. My father agreed. Augustus died in 1931. Cyrus, your grandfather, by then was 28 years old, and the slow ruin had become so much a part of him that my father, who was, you understand, a country vet and not a lawyer, simply did not know what to do with it. He kept it. He died in 1964. I inherited the box. I read it for the first time in 1997. Doc paused. I did not know what to do with it either, Nellie. I did not know how to bring this to you. The land had been sold off. Your father had died. You were teaching in Billings. The shame had settled. To rake it all up, with no train, no body, no gold, only a carbon copy of a letter that would have been called a forgery on its face, would have done you no good. I have lived with that decision for 28 years. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking you to take this paper. It is yours. It has always been yours. He held out the carbon. Nellie took it. Her gloved hand closed around the paper, very gently, the way a hand closes around a small bird. She did not cry. Jax watched her hand. He watched the way the knuckles inside the glove moved, very slightly, like she was holding the bones of a person back together. He watched her face. Her face did not change. She stood up. She folded the carbon with the same slow care back into thirds. She slid it into the inside breast pocket of her wool coat. Doc, she said. Her voice did not crack. I will see you on Sunday. I will bring pumpkin bread. I will not curse you. There is no purpose in it. But I will see you on Sunday, and we will sit at your kitchen table, and you will tell me everything else your father wrote in that book. In the order that he wrote it. She turned to Jax. Take me home, please. He drove her home in her own truck. She did not speak. The 14 below cold pressed against the windows. Smoky rode between them, alert, her amber eyes moving from Nellie's face to Jax's face. They turned in at the Whitlock 1921 sign. Jax pulled up at the porch. Nellie did not move to get out. She sat with her gloved hands in her lap, and she looked at her grandfather's house. And after a long moment she said, "It does not change the bank. Jax, I want you to understand. A carbon copy of a letter from 1923 is not $80,000. The auction will still happen on the 26th. My grandfather will still lose his house. The only difference is that when they bury me in the spring, my husband and my father and my grandfather will know that I lived long enough to know my Uncle Walter's name is clean. That is what changes today, Mr. Harlan. That is the only thing that changes today." She got out. She walked up the steps. She did not look back. Jax drove the truck into town. He returned it to the Pemberton driveway. He walked the 8 blocks back to Hollis's yard with Smokey at heel. The light was already fading. The wind had finally laid down. The temperature was at -21 and falling. He climbed into the GMC. He sat in the cab for a long time without starting the engine. Smokey lay against him. He put his hand on her head. He felt for the first time in a long time the slow, soft, hot rise of something he had not been able to identify in himself for years, something that was not grief and not anger and not even shame, but the close, low cousin to all three, the feeling a man gets when he has accepted a mission and has run it to its full extent and has come up empty. A carbon copy of a letter. A dog who paused on the eastern edge of a frozen slough and pointed her nose at black earth. He thought, very quietly, what is the use of it? He thought very quietly of the $80,000 he did not have and would never have. He thought of Wade Lacey at the gas station. He thought of Marlon Corbin's soft pink hand on the bank counter. He thought, somewhere deep, of Cassidy's wedding band taped to the bottom of a typed letter. And he thought, somewhere deeper, of Reyes in the Wadi. He thought, what is the use of any of it? What is the use of an old man pulling ties at $4 apiece? What is the use of a half-broken combat veteran walking a frozen slough in 14 below weather, looking for a train that the Pinkertons could not find in 1925? What is the use? What is the use? It was at this exact moment that, somewhere across the valley, a single rifle shot cracked through the cold dusk air. Elk hunters. The last weekend of the regular season. The rifle was a .3006, fired at a range of perhaps 2 miles, and it was followed in 8 seconds by a second shot, and in 12 more seconds by a third. Jax's body went rigid. His hands closed on the steering wheel, his eyes were open, and they were not seeing the windshield. They were seeing a dust-pale wall of compacted earth 30 inches high in a wadi outside Sangin, and the back of a young Marine in khaki walking ahead of him, and the way the sun had been coming down at a low angle so that the shadow of the man's helmet had been very long. He was hearing the small click of his own boot on a flat stone in the wadi, and he was hearing the sound that came an instant later, the sound that was not really a sound but a pressure that pushed the air out of the world. He could not move. His chest was not moving, his diaphragm was locked. His vision had narrowed to a small cone in front of him. His hands on the wheel were white. He could feel very distantly, his teeth grinding together. He could feel the cold through the windshield as a hot thing. He could feel, as if from the bottom of a well, his own voice trying to say no, and the word not coming out. Smokey moved. She did not bark. She did not lick him. She did not whine. She did the thing she had been retrained to do at Walter Reed in 2017. The thing that had been her whole job for 9 years, her whole purpose since the day they had been discharged together off the same airfield. She climbed very slowly into his lap. 91 pounds of dog. She climbed into his lap with the deliberate measured movement she had been taught, and she settled her weight directly over the long axis of his chest, her amber eyes level with his eyes from a distance of 6 inches, her breath warm and even on his face, and she pressed. Deep pressure. Sustained. Symmetrical. She breathed. 2 in, 4 out. Jax's chest, after a long time, began to move with hers. It took, he could not say how long. It might have been 3 minutes, it might have been 20, The fourth shot from the elk hunters across the valley came and went, and Smoky did not flinch when it came, and her amber eyes stayed locked on his, and her breath stayed warm on his face. And finally Jax's vision widened back out from the cone, and his hands let go of the wheel, and he set them, very carefully, one on either side of Smoky's ribs. He breathed. He breathed. He breathed. She thumped her tail. Once, very softly, against the bench seat. "All right. Soldier," he said. His voice was wet. He cleared it. "All right. All right. I'm here. I'm here." He did not turn the truck on. He sat in the dark with the dog over his chest, and he listened to the slow, deliberate work of his own breathing, and he understood, very quietly, that what he had been about to decide in the half-second before the rifle shot was that the work was over, that the carbon letter was enough, that he would tell Nellie in the morning that he had given it his honest effort and had come up empty, that the slough was buried under 14 inches of dry powder and 40 below wind chill and 101 years of every kind of failure, and that the auction was 4 weeks away, and that there was no more good he could do. He understood, with the dog's heart against his sternum and her eyes on his eyes, that his dog was not going to allow that decision. He stayed in the cab another hour. He did not start the engine. He did not turn on the heat. He simply held her and breathed. When she finally climbed off his chest very slowly and resettled on the passenger side, she did not sleep. She sat upright. Her ears were forward. She faced east, toward the slough, toward the spot beyond the cottonwoods where she had stood 3 days earlier, and pointed her nose at black earth, and her amber eyes did not move from that bearing for the rest of the night. Friday morning broke at -9 degrees, with no wind, under a sky the colour of skimmed milk. The cold had a different quality in the absence of wind. It was a cleaner cold. It pressed straight down out of the sky onto the snow and the sage and the cottonwoods, and it held there, and it did not move. Sound carried for miles in it. A dog barking in town could be heard at the homestead. A truck on the county road could be heard from the eastern fence of the slough. The world had the soft, steady ringing quality of a struck bell that has been left to fade. Jax was at the homestead by 7:30. He had not slept. He had stopped pretending that he was going to. He had drunk 2 cups of Hollis's coffee out of the percolator in the shed at 6. He had refused the third. He had loaded into the bed of the GMC his short pry bar, his 8-pound sledge, his shovel, his hand axe, a coil of 1/2-inch rope, and a pair of post-hole diggers borrowed without asking from Hollis's tool wall. He had loaded a wool blanket. He had loaded the green stenopad. He had loaded, on a hunch he could not have explained out loud, the small maglite from the glove box. He drove the 4 miles out under the slowly rising pale sun. Nellie was on her porch in a parka the colour of old moss and her grandfather's wide-brimmed felt hat. She had a thermos in one gloved hand and a paper bag in the other. She climbed into the passenger side of the GMC without a word. Smoky shifted to the floorboards to make room for her. Nellie put the thermos and the paper bag on the bench between them. The bag held warm biscuits and the thermos held coffee. She did not say good morning. She had decided sometime in the night that she was going to walk the slough with him today, and she had not asked his permission, and he did not require her to. They drove the rough 1/4 mile down the lane to the field road that ran along the inside of the eastern fence, and from there the 1/2 mile of bumpy frozen ruts to the pull-out at the rail bed, and they parked, and they got out. The slough lay below them in the new sun. It was a long, pale, shallow basin of perhaps 12 acres, bordered on the east by the rail bed and on the west by the cottonwoods, frozen smooth under 14 inches of new powder, the cattail tops poking up here and there like the masts of small lost ships. The eastern edge where Smoky had paused 4 days earlier was 30 yards north of the small wooden bridge where the rail bed crossed the drainage. Jax could find the spot from memory. He had marked the spot in the notebook with a compass bearing of 342 degrees from the bridge stringer and a distance of 91 paces. He counted the paces. Smoky walked at his right heel. Nellie walked behind him in her grandfather's hat. Slowly, deliberately, her gloved hands in her parka pockets. At 91 paces he stopped. He turned. Smoky took 2 steps past him, lifted her muzzle into the air, and stopped. "Here," he said. "To Nellie." "Here," Nellie said. They stood, the 3 of them, and they looked at the smooth pale snow. It was the second worst place in the slough to dig in winter. The earth under the powder, Jax knew, would be frozen to a depth of perhaps 26 inches at this date, and below that depth the black silty soil of the old drainage would be soft and wet, and impossible to shore up without timber, and below that, perhaps 4 to 6 feet down, would lie the original 1923 rail bed before the silt had buried it, and below that, possibly, would lie nothing at all. He took the shovel from the truck. He took the post-hole diggers. He set the wool blanket on the snow for Nellie to stand on. He took off his jacket and laid it across her shoulders over the parka, because a still cold of -9 gets into elderly bones in a way it does not get into a working man's. And Nellie did not refuse the jacket the way she had not refused the ride. She said, "Thank you, Jax." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He began to dig. The first 6 inches were the new powder. The next 20 inches were the frozen crust. The shovel did not work in the crust. He went to the post-hole digger. He chopped, and he chopped, and he chopped. The sound of steel on frozen ground rolled out across the slough and came back, doubled off. The cottonwoods on the far side. Smoky lay on the snow 10 feet to the side, her muzzle on her front paws, her amber eyes never leaving the hole. He went down through the frozen crust at 51 minutes. The first scoop of unfrozen black silt came up on the blade of the shovel. It smelled the way the slough always smelled, of iron and old vegetable matter and wet leaves. He set it aside. He went down another 6 inches. He hit nothing. He went down another foot. He hit nothing. The hole, by 10 o'clock, was a foot wide and 3 feet deep. He was kneeling in the snow at the lip of it, his arms in to the shoulder, shoveling out the soft black mud with his hands. His hands inside the leather-palmed canvas gloves were beginning to burn. He stopped. He sat back on his heels. He breathed. Nellie spoke for the first time since the truck. "Jax," she said, very quietly. "It is not here." He looked up. He did not contradict her. He looked at the dog. Smoky was sitting up. She was not looking at the hole. She had been looking at the hole for 2.5 hours, and now she was not. She was looking, instead, at a point in the slough about 14 feet to the north, the spot where he had marked, 4 days earlier, his second triangle in the green notebook, the spot where Smoky had taken her 3 deliberate steps to her left and pointed her muzzle at a slightly different angle. She stood up. She walked slowly on the 3-legged trot, past the hole, past Jax, past Nellie, 14 feet north along the eastern lip of the slough. She stopped. She lowered her head. She placed her right front paw on the snow. She lifted it. She set it down again. 6 inches forward. She lifted it again. She set it down a 3rd time. She turned her head to look at Jax. Her amber eyes were the eyes she had used in 2013 at Lashkar Gah, when she had alerted on a cache buried under 16 inches of gravel that 2 minesweepers had walked past. Jax stood. "All right. Soldier," he said. He moved the wool blanket. He moved the post-hole diggers. He moved the shovel. Nellie moved with him without speaking 14 feet north and stood again on the blanket. Smoky stepped very deliberately off the spot she had marked and lay down 4 feet away and put her muzzle on her paws and waited. He began again. He went through the new powder. He went through the frozen crust. The crust here was thinner. He was through it in 38 minutes. The black silt below it was wetter than at the first hole and smelled stronger. And at the depth of 2 feet 6 inches he hit something. It was not stone. It was not metal. It was wood. He felt it through the blade of the shovel. The blade did not stop. The blade slid sideways with a soft hollow scraping noise, the way a blade slides off the side of a buried log. He set the shovel aside. He went down on his knees. He cleared the silt with his gloved hands. The shape under his palms was a long curved object the size of a man's forearm. He cleared a foot of its length. He cleared another foot, The wood under his hands was black and soft and saturated, but it was not rotten through. It was, he understood, oak. It was, he understood, very old. It was the curve of a railroad tie, not one of the ones that had been laid on the surface in 1906. One of the ones that had been laid on a crib lower down, on a temporary trestle approach, in a section that had been buried. His hands, in the gloves, were not his hands. They were a younger man's hands. They were doing what they had been trained to do. He cleared more silt. The tie ran beneath his hands on a course that bore roughly east-northeast, away from the surface rail bed and toward the deepest part of the slough. He followed it with his hands for 4 feet. At the end of the 4 feet, his right palm slid off the wood and onto something cold and curved and heavier. Iron, old iron, oxidized to a black flaky scale. A spike. No, bigger than a spike. The angled head of a fish plate, the iron joint that joins 2 rails. He sat back on his heels. Nellie, on the wool blanket, made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of breath being released from a chest that had been holding it for a very long time. Smokey stood up. She walked again off the spot she had been lying on. She walked, this time 4 feet to the east beyond Jax's hole toward the open slough. She stopped. She lowered her muzzle into the snow. She drew it back. She did this 3 times. On the 3rd time she lifted her head, and her amber eyes were on Jax's, and her ears were forward, and she did the thing she had not done in 9 years, the thing she had been trained to do at Lackland, and had been retired from before he had ever met her. She sat down. She lifted her right front paw. She held it level with her chest in the formal alert position of a Marine Corps military working dog. Jax stopped breathing. He had never seen her do it on civilian soil. He had never expected to see her do it again as long as he lived. She was telling him, in the only language she had, that what was under her in the snow was the thing they had come for. He moved the blanket again. Nellie moved with him. He moved the tools. He took this time the hand axe and the rope from the truck, because he understood now that the depth he was going to need was not 3 feet but 6, and the silt was not going to hold the walls of a 6-foot hole at this temperature without help. He cut, with the hand axe, 4 straight willow shoots from the cottonwoods at the far edge of the slough. He drove them into the snow at the 4 corners of his planned hole. He worked. The light by noon was that high pale blue of December at 56 degrees latitude. The sun was already past its highest point. He had 3 hours of usable light. He moved methodically. He went down through the powder and the crust. He went down through the silt. He used the willow shoots to shore the walls. At 3 feet he hit a second piece of timber perpendicular to the first. At 4 feet he hit iron again, a longer piece, curved. And the curve was not the curve of a fish plate, but the curve of something rounder, something heavier, something with rivets along its lower edge. It was, he understood somewhere very deep in himself, the upper rim of a small steel pressure vessel, a locomotive boiler. He kept digging. At 4 feet 6 inches, the silt began to come up wet and almost black, and the smell of it was deeper, and he found, in the last shovelful before he cleared a working surface, a small object that did not belong with any of the rest of it. It was the size of his thumb. It was an oblong of tarnished metal. He held it up to the pale sun. It was, he saw, a brass military-style shoe button with the embossed letters NP for Northern Pacific, the kind that had been worn on the uniform jackets of railroad firemen between 1905 and 1928. He set it carefully on the wool blanket. Nellie did not move. Her gloved hands were folded in front of her. She was looking at the button. She was looking at the hole. She was looking at the dog. The skin of her face under the brim of her grandfather's felt hat was the colour of new paper. Smokey was lying 10 feet off, her muzzle on her front paws. Her amber eyes closed now, the small soft tip of her tail moving once every full minute against the snow. Her work, in this moment, was done. The mission had been identified. The remainder belonged to him. He kept digging. At 5 feet he hit with the blade of the shovel the harder ring of metal. He cleared the silt around it with his gloved hands. It was the curved black iron rim he had felt earlier, more of it now, riveted perhaps 18 inches of the upper arc of a 4-foot diameter cylinder. The cylinder lay on its side. It had been the boiler of a small Baldwin 4-4-0 locomotive of the 1910 era. He cleared 14 more inches of silt to the east of the cylinder. He hit, with the back of his right hand, a softer object. He stopped. He went down on both knees in the silt. He took off his right glove. He cleared the silt away with his bare fingers. The cold went into his hand like a bone-deep fire, and he barely felt it. The object under his hand was small, and it was curved, and it had a hard surface, and it had soft places, and it was not metal, and it was not wood, and after 20 more seconds of clearing he understood with absolute clinical military certainty what it was. It was a human ulnar, the forearm bone of a man. It was buried perhaps 2 inches below the level of the boiler cylinder, in the position a man's right arm might lie in if the man had fallen off the running board of a locomotive into wet silt, and the silt had risen over him in 9 days of flooding, in April of 1923. Jax did not move for a long time. He did not call to Nellie. He did not call to the dog. He sat on his heels in the bottom of his own 6-foot hole in a frozen Montana slough on the 18th of December in 2025, and he looked at the small brown curved bone of a man who had been 26 years old in 1923, and he thought of Reyes in the wadi outside Sangin, and he thought of his father in the Walmart parking lot in Idaho Falls, and he thought, at the very edge of his own self-awareness, of his own bones, and the place in the cab of the GMC where his bones might have been in 3 more winters if Smokey had not put her 91 pounds on his chest the night before. He cleared, very carefully, with his bare fingers, the silt away from the wrist end of the ulnar. There was something beside it. There was a small loop of dark metal, corroded and crusted over, but with the unmistakable shape of a watch chain. He cleared the chain. He cleared, at the end of the chain, a flattened silver-cased pocket watch. He turned the watch over in his palm. The case was engraved. The engraving had been protected by silt for 102 years and was almost as clear as the day it had been done. There was a small Stetson hat etched at the top of the case, and a small running horse below it, and beneath the horse, in fine engraver's script, 3 initials. W. T. W. Walter Townshend Whitlock. Jax climbed, very slowly, out of the hole. He climbed up in his stocking feet on the frozen silt walls because he had taken his boots off without realizing it. He stood at the edge of the hole. He turned. He walked, without speaking, the 8 steps to the wool blanket where Nellie Whitlock was standing in her grandfather's hat. He held out his open right palm. The pocket watch lay on the palm. The chain trailed across his wrist. Nellie looked at the watch. She did not take it. She did not reach for it. She simply looked for a long time with her gloved hands at her sides, and then her gloved right hand came up, slowly, and her fingers brushed the etched horse on the case. "Oh," she said. It was a small sound. "Oh." Her knees gave out. She went down softly into the snow on the wool blanket. She did not fall. She lowered. She knelt with her gloved hands palm down on her thighs, and her grandfather's wide-brimmed felt hat tipped forward and shadowed her face, and she made, for the first time since Jax had met her, a sound that was the sound of weeping, only it was a quieter sound than that, and a longer sound, and a sound that had been held inside the ribs of one woman and her father and her grandfather and her great-grandfather for 102 years. Smokey stood up. The dog did not bark, she did not whine. She did the second thing she had not done in 9 years on civilian soil. She walked, on the 3-legged trot, the 10 feet from her marker spot to the kneeling old woman on the blanket. She sat down in front of Nellie. She tilted her muzzle up. She placed her muzzle, very gently, against the thin skin of Nellie Whitlock's throat, in the small soft hollow under the angle of the jaw, and she held it there. Nellie's gloved arms went around the dog's neck. Jax stood 10 feet away with the watch in his palm, and the silt drying on his bare hand, and the cold beginning to bite his stocking feet, and he watched the woman in his oversized field jacket and his dog held against each other in the snow, and he understood, with a force that stopped his breath, that he was looking at his own grief in a body older and smaller than his own. He was looking at exactly what nobody had been allowed to do for him on the porch in Bozeman the day Mrs. Henning had drawn her curtains. He was looking at exactly what he himself had not allowed Smokey to do for him for the first 3 months at Walter Reed, when he had pushed her away every time she had tried. His eyes burned. He turned his face, very slightly, away from them, the way a man turns his face from a private thing. He stood with his back to the slough and the buried boiler and the small bone of a hand and the watch in his palm, and the sun came down through the high pale blue Montana sky onto the back of his neck, and he let it land there. He did not wipe his face. The tears, when they came once, and they were brief, and they were the only tears he had cried since 2017, and they froze on his beard before they had reached his jaw. When he turned back, Nellie was on her feet. Her face under the brim of the hat was wet, but her eyes were perfectly steady. Smokey stood at her right knee, in the formal heel position of a working dog. Smokey's right shoulder was pressed against the side of Nellie's leg. The dog had transferred her watch. "Mr. Harlan," Nellie said. Her voice did not crack. "We will need the sheriff." "Yes, ma'am." "And Doc Pemberton." "Yes, ma'am." "And we will not be telling the bank." "No, ma'am." She paused. She looked at the watch in his palm. She did not take it. She did not yet feel that she had earned the right to take it. She would, Jax understood, at the proper time. "My Uncle Walter is here," she said. The word was quiet. "My Uncle Walter has been here, 22 yards north of the bridge stringer, for 102 years and 7 months. And tonight, Mr. Harlan, for the first time, he is not alone." The light in the slough was beginning to turn. Jax looked at his stocking feet, which were beginning to lose feeling, and at the dog who was watching the old woman, and at the woman who was looking past him into the cottonwoods. He thought very simply that this was the work the day had been given to him to do, and that he had done it, and that the rest of what was going to happen now belonged not to him, but to people with offices and forms and procedures and laws, and that his role in all of that was going to be small, and that this small thing was nevertheless going to be the most significant thing he had done since the day he had carried Smokey off a Marine Corps medical tent table in 2016. He pulled his boots back on, he helped Nellie to her grandfather's truck. He left the hole open, with the willow shoots in it, and the wool blanket folded across the lip of it as a marker, and the dog, on his command, took up a position 15 feet to the upwind side in the exact formal cordon of a working dog guarding a recovery site, and she did not move from that position for the next 3 hours while Jax and Nellie drove into town. Sheriff Donovan Reese was 46 years old, an Army National Guard veteran of 2 tours in Iraq, and he was the only sheriff Coleridge County had elected 3 terms running who had not been a Lacey or a cousin to one. He came out to the slough in his county Tahoe at 3:40 in the afternoon with Doc Pemberton in the passenger seat. He looked into the hole, he looked at the watch on the wool blanket beside it, he looked at the dog standing the cordon, he looked at Jax, he looked at Nellie, he took off his hat. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I'm very sorry it has been 102 years. Nellie nodded. Once, the way she had nodded at the bank. He called the State Crime Lab in Helena from the cab of his Tahoe at 4 in the afternoon. He called the Montana Historical Society at 4:15. He called the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Salt Lake City at 4:30 on Doc Pemberton's quiet advice, because the recovery of a 100-year-old shipment of unsmelted gold bullion across 2 state lines was a thing that fell, in some technical reading of the federal code, under their jurisdiction, and because the only way to keep the next 30 days from becoming a feeding frenzy was to have a federal field agent on the scene by Sunday morning. The State Crime Lab arrived on Saturday at noon in 2 unmarked Suburbans. The forensic team was led by a woman named Dr. Marisol Vasquez, mid-50s, grey bun, hand warmers in both pockets of her parka, who had spent 15 years on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and who took one look at the way Jax had shored the walls of the hole with willow shoots and turned to Sheriff Reese and said, "Whoever did this dig knows what he is doing. Do not let anyone else touch this site until my people are done." The forensic recovery took 11 days. It went forward through Christmas and into the new year. Jax worked alongside Dr. Vasquez's team in an unpaid volunteer capacity, doing the things he had done in 2012 in eastern Afghanistan with a different forensic team and a different set of remains, and Dr. Vasquez, after the second day, simply began handing him the smaller field tools without commentary. Smokey lay on a folded blanket at the lip of the hole through every working hour, her amber eyes on the team, her body still, the formal cordon dog. Nellie came every day at noon, with thermoses of soup and biscuits and pumpkin bread, and she sat on a folding chair Sheriff Reese had brought from his garage, and she watched, and she did not ask to look into the hole. By the 7th of January, the team had recovered the partial remains of 2 adult human males, one set found in the immediate vicinity of the boiler, and the other set found 9 feet to the east. They had recovered the boiler and the running gear, and the partial frame of the locomotive. They had recovered the badly degraded wooden shells of 2 cars. They had recovered, from the second car, on the morning of the 8th of January, a single intact wooden crate, banded in iron, stamped on the lid in a faded ink that was still legible, property of Augustus Whitlock Estate, private hold, milled bullion, April 1923. They had recovered. In total, 211 pounds of milled gold bullion in 24 ingots. Dr. Vasquez weighed the ingots 3 times. She filed her preliminary report in Helena on the 9th of January. The State Historical Society and the FBI field agent, a serious, quiet man named Special Agent Daniel Hewitt, witnessed the weight and the seal on a chain of custody log. The market value of the recovered gold, at the spot price on the morning of the 9th of January, was $41,860,000. The legal question, on the morning of the 10th of January, was who owned it. Marlon Corbin moved fast. He filed a claim, in the name of First Yellowstone Bank of Coleridge Junction, on the morning of the 10th, on the legal theory that the gold had been recovered from land that was, in 7 days' time, to be auctioned by the bank under a legitimate foreclosure proceeding, and that any chattel goods recovered from the parcel between the date of the foreclosure notice and the date of the auction passed by Montana statute on lis pendens with the land. He was seen walking into the bank that morning with a man in a charcoal suit who had driven up from Bozeman in a black Range Rover. The man in the suit was a senior partner at a real estate development firm called Sage Ridge Holdings. By 11 that morning, Wade Lacey was at the Sinclair telling anyone who would listen that the picker had been digging on Whitlock land without permission, and that any gold he had pulled out of the ground was the property of the bank, and through the bank the property of Sage Ridge, and through Sage Ridge, by some loose chain of association that Wade Lacey had not entirely thought through, the property of the real Americans of Coleridge County, and not the property of an old woman who could not even keep up with her balloon payment. Doc Pemberton telephoned Jax at the homestead at 1 in the afternoon. "Jax," Doc said, "there is a paper in my father's daybook I should have shown you on Thursday. It is in the entry for the 18th of April, 1923. I'm bringing it now. Have your notebook open." Doc arrived at the homestead at 1:45 with the entire daybook and a manila folder. The paper inside the manila folder was a copy of an original document held in the Whitlock family safe deposit box at First Yellowstone Bank of Coleridge Junction, a copy that had been made by Doc Pemberton Sr. in 1923 for the Whitlock family. On the 19th of April, 6 days after the disappearance of the train, in his capacity as a witness at the request of Augustus Whitlock. The document was a private deed of conveyance executed on the 3rd of April 1923, 8 days before train number 7 had departed the Whitlocks. Under its terms, Augustus Whitlock had conveyed, irrevocably and in full, the entirety of his unsmelted placer gold reserves, including the 218 pounds of bullion then being prepared for shipment, into a private trust held for the equal benefit of his two sons, Walter Townshend Whitlock and Cyrus Augustus Whitlock, and their issue per stirps in perpetuity. The deed of conveyance had been notarized by the Coleridge County Notary, witnessed by Doc Pemberton Sr. and by an attorney named Daniel R. Brennan of Billings, and recorded on the 4th of April 1923 at the Coleridge County Courthouse, where it had remained, in linen-bound volume 14 of the Miscellaneous Records, for 102 years unconsulted. The deed had a single critical clause. It stated, in plain language at the bottom of the second page, that the gold thus conveyed remained, in all events of loss, theft, or shipment failure, the absolute property of the trust, and was not subject to any lien, claim, attachment, or encumbrance of any third party, including but not limited to common carriers, insurers, or successors entitled to the surface rights of any land upon which the gold might subsequently come to rest. Walter had left no issue. Cyrus's daughter's daughter, by clean line of inheritance, was Eleanor Whitlock. Doc handed the manila folder to Jax. Jax read the deed twice. He read the critical clause 3 times. He looked at Doc. "This will hold," he said. "It will hold," Doc said. Daniel Brennan was Augustus's lawyer in Billings. He filed it in 2 places. I filed his own copy in the courthouse the next morning at the courthouse on Augustus's instruction. There is an attestation on the record. The land sale tomorrow week is not relevant to the gold. The gold is not part of the land. It has been Whitlock family property since the 3rd of April 1923. Jax took the folder to Nellie. She read the deed at her kitchen table. She set down her reading glasses. She set down the deed. She put both gloved hands flat on the table, and she breathed, 2 in, 4 out, for a full minute. She did not cry. She had cried in the slough on the 18th of December, and Jax did not believe she would cry again in this life until the day she died. "My grandfather knew about this deed," she said. "He must have known." "He knew," Doc said. "He could not prove it. The original was held in the family safe deposit box. Augustus had given the access keys to Walter to take east. The keys went down with the train. The bank sealed the box on the 8th of May 1923 pending probate. Probate took until 1933. By the time the box was opened, the original deed had been removed. Doc paused. "Removed by whom?" Nellie said. "By Carlton Lacey," Doc said. "Wade Lacey's great-grandfather. He was the assistant manager of First Yellowstone Bank of Coleridge Junction in 1933. He was the man who oversaw the opening of the box. My father suspected at the time. He could not prove it. Carlton Lacey died in 1947, very quietly wealthy, and his eldest son inherited his position at the bank. And that son's son was Marlon Corbin's father-in-law, which is how Marlon Corbin came to be the assistant manager of that institution." The room was silent for a long time. "Doc," Jax said. "Finally. My copy here. This is your father's copy of the recorded deed. The one in volume 14 at the courthouse." "Yes." "Recorded on the 4th of April 1923. "Yes." "And anyone could have walked into that records room any time in the last 102 years and read it." "Yes." "Marlon Corbin's family has been in the bank since 1933. "Yes." "And nobody on his side ever mentioned it." "No." Jax was very quiet. "It is in their interest," he said, "for it to never be mentioned." "That has been so," Doc said, "for 102 years. Sheriff Reese came at 4. Jax laid out the deed for him on the kitchen table. The sheriff read it twice. He took photographs of all 3 pages. He called the FBI field agent Hewitt at 4:22, and he read him the critical clause aloud over the truck radio, slowly, because Special Agent Hewitt was at the slough and did not have a copy in his hand. Special Agent Hewitt drove to Nellie's homestead at 5. He read the deed himself at the kitchen table. He spent 11 minutes on it. He looked up at Nellie. He looked at Jax. He looked at Doc Pemberton. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I'm going to file the Federal Protective Order on the recovered chattel tonight. The gold is not going to leave the State Crime Lab inventory until the probate court of Coleridge County rules on the trust succession, and the probate court is not going to rule on it before the auction next week. The bank is going to claim the gold tomorrow morning. The bank is going to lose. Mr. Corbin is going to lose every appeal he files until the recovered chattel is released into your custody. I would estimate that takes 6 to 9 months after that. The gold is yours. Nellie did not move. Mr. Hewitt, she said, the land auction is on the 26th of January. That is 12 days from tomorrow. If I lose the homestead at auction, do I lose any portion of the gold? No, ma'am, the deed is clear. The gold is the property of the trust, and the trust has held it irrevocably since the 3rd of April 1923. The land is the land, the gold is the gold. The fact that the gold has come to rest, geographically, on the land does not change its title. Mr. Corbin is going to argue that it does. In the morning, he is going to lose. And the gold, Nellie said, in the meanwhile, can be borrowed against... Special Agent Hewitt looked at her. He almost smiled. He did not let himself... With a federal letter of protective custody and an attestation from Dr. Vasquez of weight and provenance, he said, any reputable bank in Helena will lend you the $80,000 to satisfy the balloon payment by Wednesday afternoon. Ma'am, probably 90% of those banks you will not need first Yellowstone. Nellie folded her hands on the table. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, very softly, Jax, I would like you to drive me to Helena on Monday morning. Yes, ma'am. The drive to Helena was 4 hours each way. On Monday morning, Jax, Nellie, Doc Pemberton and Smokey left Coleridge Junction at 6 in the green 1988 Ford F-150. They arrived at First Helena Trust at 10:15. Nellie carried the federal letter of protective custody and a notarized copy of the 18-page deed of conveyance and an attestation from Dr. Vasquez and Doc Pemberton's father's daybook. The bank president herself, a woman named Karina Halverson, came out of her office to meet them. The loan was approved at 12:37 in the afternoon. The cashier's check for $80,000.12, the exact figure of the balloon plus interest through the 18th of January, was issued at 1:15. Marlon Corbin received the check across his counter at First Yellowstone Bank of Coleridge Junction at 5:58 on Monday afternoon, 2 minutes before the bank closed. He did not speak when Jax handed it to him. His soft pink hand took the check. His eyes moved from the check to Jax's face and back to the check. He stamped it. He looked up. Mrs. Whitlock, he said. He had to say it twice. Mrs. Whitlock. This satisfies the balloon. Yes. Marlon, Nellie said, from where she stood at Jax's right shoulder. That is the entire purpose of it. The note is paid. The note is paid. There will not be an auction. There will not be an auction. Marlon Corbin's jaw worked. He glanced over his shoulder at his office. The man in the charcoal suit from Sage Ridge was gone. The man in the charcoal suit had received the news from the Federal Protective Order on Sunday evening and had departed Coleridge Junction in his Range Rover at 6 in the morning on Monday and had not returned. Marlon Corbin was alone behind his counter on a winter Monday at 6 o'clock in the evening, in a county he had grown up believing belonged to him. He stamped the check a second time. The stamp was unnecessary. He stamped it because his right hand needed something to do. Will there be anything else? Mrs. Whitlock, he said. The voice was thinner than it had been at the counter on the 6th of December. There will be, Marlon, there will be one more thing. Nellie reached into the inside breast pocket of her wool coat. She took out a single piece of yellowed onion skin paper folded into thirds, the carbon copy of Henrik Olsen's letter to his brother in Minneapolis, dated the 10th of April 1923. She did not hand it to him. She held it up where he could read the date and the signature. She put it back in her coat. 102 years and 7 months. Marlon, she said, I want you to think about that. The next time you sit at my kitchen table to walk a widow through a balloon payment. She turned. She walked out of the bank. The brass bell on the door rang once. Wade Lacey was not in the gas station parking lot on the morning of Tuesday the 20th of January. He was not there on Wednesday. He was not there for the rest of the winter. By the time he came back in late March, with a different group of friends and a quieter walk, he did not look at Jax Harlan when Jax came in to pay for gas, and he did not say the word picker, and he did not, for that matter, say anything to anyone about the Whitlocks ever again. Sheriff Reese stopped Jax on the sidewalk outside Polly's diner on Thursday the 22nd of January. Jax had Smokey on a slack lead. The sheriff was in his uniform jacket. He stood, very straight, the way a man who had been a soldier stood. He saluted, very briefly. He let the salute drop. "Sergeant," he said, "I would be honored if you would stand with me at the reburial on the spring thaw. Mrs. Whitlock is having her Uncle Walter and Mr. Olson brought home in May. I would like you and your dog to stand with the family." Jax was quiet a moment. He did not trust his voice immediately. Then he said, "Yes. Sheriff, we will stand. Thank you, Sergeant." The sheriff put on his hat. He walked on toward the courthouse. Smokey pressed her shoulder against the side of Jax's calf, and the small soft tip of her tail moved, exactly once, against the cuff of his pants. The reburial was on the second Saturday in May. The slough was green by then. The cottonwoods were leafed. The apple orchard behind the homestead had begun, against every projection of the county extension agent, to bud out for the first time in 14 years. Nellie Whitlock had used a small portion of the released trust funds to put a new tin roof on her grandfather's house, and to have the porch posts straightened, and to have a small clean white workshop built 200 yards back from the house at the edge of the orchard, with electricity from the ranch line, and a wood stove and a long oak workbench. Jax had built himself out of 3 salvaged 1880 railroad ties above the door of the workshop. On a small carved sign Jax had cut from a section of date-nailed oak tie was a single line he had routed with his hands, in plain letters, for the men he intended to teach there. "The world throws away still has work in it." Smokey lay in the sun on the new porch boards of the homestead, her muzzle on her front paws, her amber eyes half closed against the May light. The very tip of her tail moved, once every full minute, the way it always had, against the warm planks. Jax stood at the railing in a clean shirt. Nellie stood beside him. The sun came down through the cottonwoods. The work was not finished. It would not be finished. It was for the first time in 9 years his... If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.